Hello, welcome to our very last lecture of the semester. After today and the final exam, you won't have to hear my voice anymore, ever again. But I hope that you walk away from this class and the semester with a greater understanding of U.S. history. Because, like I said in our very first class, I believe that understanding where we came from and our history is important in making a positive impact on the future. We started the semester with the end of the Civil War and the Reconstruction of America. And today we'll talk about how things have that we've discussed all throughout this semester have built up, accumulated into our present day. Now, I believe it's difficult for historians to write about the recent past, largely because we've lived through it, and because that we don't have the benefit of hindsight, knowing what will come next. We aren't fortune tellers. We can't tell the future. For example, at the end of World War One, people called it the war to end all wars, the Great War. And how can a war so devastating ever happen again? Now we know that with the benefit of hindsight, that this uneasy peace treaty of Versailles, along with the Great Depression, set up the rise of fascism and the rise of Adolf Hitler and eventually World War II. But people at the end of World War I had no way of knowing that just around the corner, another world war was going to happen. My point is that we don't know what the future holds. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, or or for that matter, what's going to happen a month from now. I mean, 2 months ago, we were meeting face to face, and I would have never guessed that we would have spent the last month in a pandemic under isolation and social distancing. That's just something that never occurred to most of us that this could happen in America. Now, like I said, I'm not a fortune teller, and like I said in our very first class, history can't predict the future, but we can use this information that we have researched and gathered um, to come up with how things are in the present. How are things are how do things get to the way they are? And I believe history provides those answers. So that brings us into this bonus lecture, right? So today, for a potential bonus points on your final exam, I want you to explore these essay topics, right? Remember, you have to answer every part of these questions in order to receive full bonus points for that essay in the final. So the essay question for today is what are some of the major events that define the years 2000 through 2019? How do these events impact our lives and America's today and now and into the future? And what are some things that you will take away from this class? What are some things that you learned and now appreciate? I hope appreciate about history. And then also we have some ID terms. These ID terms won't be on the final exam, but they will be essential parts to answer these essay questions, right? So this is part one, and then part two goes into the second video that I'm going to do, part two. So that's the essay question for today's lecture. And these questions are sort of an open concept, right? They could be answered in many different ways. So keep these questions in mind as we go through this video. Um, Now we are going to discuss some of the major events of the 21st century, such as the War on Terror, the accelerating inequality that's taking place in America, growing diversity, changing climate, political stalemate, which has defined our politics for the past 2 decades, right? All these things which make up our present day that have accumulated and built and become more of an issue in the past recent decades. All right, so let's get into this. When we last left off, we discussed Ronald Reagan's presidency and the rise of the New Right and the Cold War. Uh, and I'll just give sort of a short overview of the 90s, right? So Ronald Reagan's out of office. He spent 2 terms there. He became one of the most successful presidents popular presidents in U.S. history in recent decades. Then George H.W. Bush took the office, and during Bush's presidency, he oversaw the collapse of the Soviet Union on December 25th, 1991. At the Kremlin, Russia's center of government in Moscow, a new tricolored flag of the Russian Confederation was raised. So the Russian Confederation is now the Russian government that exists today, that came out of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The desolation of the Soviet Union left the United States as the only remaining superpower in the world, and global capitalism seemed triumphant. America seemed to have won between the 1990s and about 2010, that we just didn't have any major world competitor between this time period of 1990 all the way up to 2010. But America yet again, like at the end of World War II, was a large, unrivaled power. But we will discuss how in a little bit this has came to an end. In the past decade, really, we see the rise of Russia as a growing power in Eastern Europe. We see the economic unification of the UN, and also we have China, whose GDP is predicted to surpass America within the next couple of decades. So after 2010, as we'll discuss in part two, we start to see a decline in America's international influence. But during this decade of 1990 all the way up to 2010, this 20-year span, the U.S. Was largely unrivaled economically and, for that matter, militarily. Um, so how does this happen? Anyway, Bush's presidency, during Bush's presidency, the Soviet Union fell. The economy was doing well. But in 1990, Saddam Hussein, remember we mentioned him in our last video, Saddam Hussein was the dictator of Iraq who the U.S. funded in the 80s to attack Iran. Now Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, this oil-rich country in the Middle East, and the U.S. responded by intervening in Iraq to protect its oil interests in the Middle East, which is called Operation Desert Storm, or the Gulf War, as it's known. So Desert Storm was a very short military intervention and the U.S. military quickly overwhelmed the Iraqi forces. However, this military intervention in Iraq eventually led to this war on terror and growing military intervention in the Middle East that has been nonstop for the past 20 years. But at the time, the success of Desert Storm made President Bush very popular, and he was a pretty popular president. But when he ran for re-election in 1992, the more conservative New Right, remember we mentioned the rise of the New Right in our last class, the New Right really didn't see President Bush as the next Ronald Reagan, right? They viewed him as sort of a lame duck in that he didn't represent the goals of the New Right. So in the 1990 election, in 1992, the Republican Party didn't really fully back President Bush, which split the vote. And this led to the Democratic candidate, Bill Clinton, becoming the next president of the United States. Bill Clinton was the first baby boomer to become president, right? So he was younger. He represented this younger generation, and also he represented this new Democrats as well. Clinton oversaw the transition in the Democratic Party. Clinton and his running mate, Tennessee Senator Al Gore, both moderate Southerners, promised away from the old liberalism of the 1970s and 80s. Remember that the old Democrats of the 70s, 80s, like um, like those leaders that we talked about in our previous lectures, they they saw a huge landslide of political defeats, especially President Jimmy Carter, who we mentioned had a very difficult presidency and really hurt the Democrats' gains. But Bill Clinton and Al Gore offered a alternative. They were Democrats, but they were conservative Democrats, and these so-called New Democrats um, favored things like economic stimulus package, universal health care, and continuation of peace talks in the Middle East, along with growing social welfare, which is completely different than the rise of the new right. Right, so we see this new right conservatism in the Republican Party taking place, right? Which favored tax cuts, reductions of healthcare and welfare in the United States. But also, we at the same time we see this rise of the New Democrat, which favors essentially the opposite, right? Taxes of the rich, universal health care, and social welfare programs, um, among many things. So we start to see this polarization of extreme rights and left taking place in U.S. politics that has continued for the past several decades. Um, but these things continue to be a core policy of the Democratic Party today. But they were vastly different than the core values of the Democratic parties of the 70s and 80s. So in the 90s, we see to this transition into the new Democratic Party. So you see this polarization of U.S. politics that exists today, and we'll talk a little bit more of that. Um, so just to summarize Clinton's presidency real quick, the Rust Belt continued to lose industry. Factories moved south and across the Sun Belt, which we mentioned in our last lecture. But also during the 90s, many companies moved to different countries, like many countries across Asia and especially northern Mexico, where these industries could pay workers below the U.S.'s minimum wage, right, in order to keep costs down and make them more rich. But generally, Clinton was a president at the time of a economic boom in America, fueled by the emergent computing technologies. Right, personal computers had skyrocketed in sales, and the internet had become a mass phenomenon. Communication and commerce were never again the same. The tech boom was driven by business, and the 1990s saw a robust and uh, increase in entrepreneurship. Investors scrambled to find the next Microsoft or Apple. Suddenly, massive computer companies started to take place, right? So, even today, Microsoft and Apple control a vast majority of the technological market, and this is really where these things started to boom during the 1990s. Uh, and we see in the 90s the development of the internet, which has revolutionized the world. The dot-com boom fueled enormous economic growth and substantial financial speculation for the next Google or Amazon, right? So everyone wanted in on the next Google or Amazon. They wanted in on this new technology. And in turn, all that investment caused the economy to increase during this time. So 90s, then during the 90s, there was a huge economic boom that was taking place, um, and uh, and this has continued to go on for the past several decades. Many of you were probably very young when the internet became widely used, but we have lived through an extraordinary time in human history where we have all the information we could possibly have in the palm of our hands and our smartphones. And 30 years ago, this would have been almost unthinkable, right? So we're seeing this massive technological advancement taking place in the 90s and into the early 2000s. I mean, if it wasn't for modern technology, we wouldn't have been able to complete this class, yet alone complete the semester. So it's a big deal, and we'll discuss more technology's impact on society in part two of this video. So anyway, the economy is doing really well in the 90s thanks to technology. Clinton was receiving a lot of popularity, but word of his sexual scandal got into a investigation, and eventually Clinton resigned. Right, so because of Clinton's sexual scandal, he resigned as president, um, and then Al Gore became president for a very short time. But then this leads us into the year 2000, right? 20 years ago, and the election of 2000. So, in the next election, Clinton's former VP Al Gore ran against George W. Bush, the former President Bush's son. Gore had won the popular vote by 500,000 votes, but the Electoral College contested the Florida election. On election night, media called for Florida, called that Gore had won Florida, but then Bush made late gains, and news organizations reversed this, declaring that Bush had won Florida. Um, and Bush was the probable president elect. So there was this. This was one of the first elections where votes were counted electronically, and this led to a miscount in votes, especially in the area of Florida, right? So the whole election depended on who won Florida. Even though Gore won the popular vote, our president is elected by the Electoral College, so this was a huge deal. Um, and eventually, a recount was made, and it showed that Bush had won Florida by 537 votes. So Bush could have just lost the presidency, right? But because of this recount, it showed that he had actually won Florida by 537 votes. One of the closest vote counts in U.S. history, right? So because of this, the course of American history changed essentially for the past 20 years. So Bush became the next president of the United States. Then, shortly after Bush's election, disaster struck. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, 19 operatives of the Al Qaeda terrorist organization hijacked four passenger planes on the East Coast. American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, which was the tallest building in the world and the sort of representation of American capitalism and its success. So a plane flew into the World Trade Center, and then another flight crashed into the Pentagon in Washington D.C. And then United Airlines Flight 93 crashed outside a field in Pennsylvania, brought down by passengers who had received word of the hijackings and decided to crash the plane into the ground instead of taking more lives. In less than 2 hours, nearly 3,000 Americans had been killed. Most of you probably do not remember this. I was only in elementary school when 9/11 happened. Mostly, I remember being sent to the gym along with the rest of school, watching the news, and this general feeling of panic. I was really young at this time. People at this time didn't know if there would be more attacks or if there would be invasion or what was happening. They just know that attacks had happened. Um, and we had just moved to Atlanta at this time. I did. So my dad started this new job, and no one had cell phone. My parents didn't have cell phones at this point, right? So they couldn't call the school. They didn't know what was happening, uh, and it was just a very chaotic time. And I'm sure many people who remember this and were young at the time probably have similar stories. Like I said, 3,000 people died in less than 2 hours, and America was shook. This was the equivalent of the attack on Pearl Harbor in America, right? This was it shocked America. And late that night, Bush addressed the nation and assured the country that the search is underway for those who are responsible for these evil acts. 9/11 showed the world that we were vulnerable, right? That even though we had won the Cold War, um, we were not safe at home. That there's this ever looming threat of terrorism, which before people that were thinking like, oh, sure, these terrorist organizations exist, but they're all the way over there, right? They're in the Middle East, they're in these other countries. But 9/11 showed us that we could become vulnerable here. So, U.S. intelligence uncovered that the terrorist group Al Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, um, was in Afghanistan. So this led the U.S. to to invade Afghanistan, leading the Bush administration to declare war. And Bush declared this thing called the Bush Doctrine, which state that the U.S. could invade any country associated with terrorism. After the Afghan invasion, there was some claims that Saddam Hussein the leader of Iraq, had weapons of mass destruction, leading to Bush then declaring war on Iraq and getting involved there and eventually overthrowing Saddam Hussein. This put America as the new global police force in the world. Uh, this has led to 2 decades of military involvement in the Middle East that continues today. The seemingly never-ending war on terror. This enters this war on terrorism that exists today, but also at this time we see a rise of you know of bias against Muslims in America, right? And also we see a increase in government surveillance. The government has way more involvement in surveillance than it has ever had before. Uh, the government really could tell what any one of us are doing at any time, largely because this growth of homeland security after the 9/11 invasions and the war on terrorism. So this was a big event that has defined the past 20 years. And it occurred in 2001, but continues to go on today with U.S. troops still present in the Middle East. Um, so Bush's early presidency was dominated by the 9/11 attacks and the war on terror. But then in his second term in August 2005, the U.S. was hit again, but this time by a natural disaster uh, called Hurricane Katrina. In August of 2005, almost 2,000 Americans and millions of others were left homeless along the Gulf Coast and New Orleans because of Hurricane Katrina. Uh, critis- Critics criticized the Bush administration in result of how he responded to the natural disaster, um, making his popularity eventually plummet as the economy continued to hurt because of this. Critics really attacked Bush's sort of response to this crisis and hurt his presidency. Also, during the Bush years, we see an increase of immigration from Hispanics into the United States, which further polarized politics and harm Bush's popularity and the Republicans Party's chances of reelection in 2008. So we're seeing these major events happening: the war on terror, Hurricane Katrina, and rise of immigration, illegal immigration in the United States, which all ended up harming the Republican Party's chances of reelection in 2008. Now, like I said earlier, this is really just a quick overview of what's happening in the 90s and early 2000s. Really, we could go on for a very long time about this, but we sort of need to move on. So, like I said earlier, in the 90s, the economy was booming. And just like in the 1920s, speculation had caused the US economy to blow up into this big bubble that eventually popped and caused the worst recession since the Great Depression. This is called the Great Recession of 2008. One of the main causes of the recession was massive over speculation and mismanagement of real estate in the housing bubble. Mortgage companies began writing increasingly risky loans and then building them together and selling them over and over again, sometimes so quickly that it became difficult to determine exactly who owned what. So the real estate industry started to take out these allow people to take out these crazy loans, not really looking into if they could pay them back, and this led to massive speculation over sale of loans, and eventually this bubble got bigger and bigger and bigger as the housing market increased. But eventually, this bubble popped and caused this great recession to take place. A lack of oversight in real estate since the 90s caused over speculation and eventually led to the economic bubble to pop in 2008. People found it extremely difficult to take out loans after this, and this further hurt the economy. Remember, I said that during the 80s, right? High interest loans, because trying to regulate the market had caused people not to take out loans and hurt the economy during the 80s. This is happening now during the 2008 recession, but to a greater extent. The government reacted by pouring billions and billions of dollars into banks. This started with President Bush, and in the last year of his campaigns, he was funding billions of dollars into banks, and eventually Obama did this as well. But the banks decided to shut down and keep this money for themselves, while the rest of the American people suffered. The effects of the housing market eventually made a huge impact on the rest of the American economy as we see growing layoffs and unemployment across the board. Also, during this time, we see this rise in unemployment for college graduates during this 2008 crisis. That these people are graduating from college but unable to receive jobs because the economy is doing poorly. I'm sure many of you have family or know someone who was impacted by the Great Recession, but really it was the largest economic recession since the Great Depression. So while American banks quickly recovered and recaptured some steady profits because of the government bailouts, the American stock market continued to climb to new heights. But individual American workers continued to lag. Job growth was slow, and unemployment rates remained stubbornly high for years. Wages froze. Meanwhile, well paying full time jobs that were often uh, were replaced by low paying part time work, which we'll discuss a lot more in part two. Generations of workers coming to age within this crisis, moreover, had been savaged by the economic collapse. Unemployment among the young Americans hovered for years and nearly doubled the national average. Right, so unemployment for individual Americans continued to grow larger and larger and continues to exist today, where we have many Americans who are young and they're not able to receive full-time work with benefits because the economy has shifted in such a way in the past really decade or so that there are more part-time work on the market instead of full-time jobs, or people are less willing to hire a full-time person when they could just hire a lower wage part-time worker. So these events sort of burst in the 2008 Great Recession and continued to have a long-lasting impact on the American economy, um, really up to the present day. And but unfortunately, as we'll get into part two, um, because of the everything that's going on, we see another potential huge dip in the economy. All right, so I think that's a good stopping place for part one. Please look at part two, where we discuss U.S. history from 2008 all the way up to the present. So thank you for tuning into this lecture. I hope you learned something about the 1990s all the way up to 2008. All right, so please watch part two of this video in order to fully answer and receive full credit for that bonus essay for your final exam. All right, thank you.